At 4:17 a.m., somewhere beneath Berlin, a room full of men realized the war was already lost, even though no one dared to say it out loud. There were no explosions, no alarms, no enemy soldiers at the gates. Only the low hum of electric lights, the rustle of maps being unfolded, and a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest. In that moment, the Third Reich did not fall to bombs or armies. It fell to a decision, a quiet order, written in ink, carried by messengers, and destined to send millions forward with no path back. It was made far from the trenches, far from frozen blood and shattered bud. It was written across maps, stretched over dark wooden tables, under artificial lights that never knew dawn. In those rooms, the war no longer sounded like gunfire. It sounded like silence. The Third Reich still spoke the language of victory, but its leaders no longer slept. Footsteps echoed through corridors with controlled urgency. Conversations ended abruptly. Reports were handled with care, as if the paper itself might fracture under the weight of what it revealed. To the east, winter advanced like an unseen army. Wind-pierced uniforms, burned skin, and carried with it the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. The war machine, once precise and confident, had begun to grind against reality. The decision that would doom the Reich was not born from open desperation, but from something far more dangerous: absolute conviction. The belief that willpower could replace logistics, that ideology could overpower geography, that discipline and fear could bend time itself. Germany was no longer fighting only its enemies. It was fighting distance, climate, exhaustion, the immutable laws of war. Inside headquarters, maps were updated with colored pins, red advances, blue withdrawals, often minimized, sometimes ignored. The silence between briefings pressed down harder than any bombardment. Veteran generals' men, shaped by past wars, men who understood the price of each mile taken, hesitated before speaking. They knew words carried consequences, and they knew some truths were no longer welcome. At the center of it all, the leader watched with unblinking eyes. For him, retreat was not a tactical option. It was a moral failure. Every village abandoned was betrayal. Every withdrawal, weakness. War had ceased to be a contest of strategy and become a test of faith. And faith, in this system, demanded total sacrifice. At their front, soldiers dug trenches into frozen ground. Shovels struck earth with a dull, metallic rhythm. Hands cracked and bled. Breath emerged in white clouds that vanished instantly. Many still believed in victory, not out of ideology, but necessity. Hope was the last shelter against terror. Letters from home were read until the ink faded. Creased photographs of wives, children, and mothers became talismans against chaos. The decision took form as a simple order: hold the line. No retreat. Cities were to become fortresses even when surrounded. Reports of supply shortages were dismissed. Ammunition counts ignored. Exhaustion reframed as weakness. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If every man held to the end, the enemy would break first. But war is not a contest of pure will. It is an unforgiving calculation of resources, morale, and time. Above, Allied bombers followed familiar routes across darkened skies. Air raid sirens cut through the night, long and shrill, like mechanical cries of mourning. Civilians descended into shelters clutching hastily packed bags, drowsy children, fragments of normal life. Dust and crushed concrete filled the air. Fear lingered in every breath, yet propaganda still spoke of heroic resistance, of destiny waiting just beyond the final sacrifice. Behind closed doors, understanding began to spread, not suddenly, but gradually, like cold seeping into a poorly sealed room. Reports from the Eastern Front spoke of entire divisions encircled, of supply lines severed, of men fighting on starvation rations. In the West, pressure mounted. The war had become truly global, and the Reich was stretched thin. A blade pulled too far. Reality, the order not to yield ground, transformed tactical setbacks into strategic disasters. Units that could have withdrawn and regrouped were annihilated. Officers who adapted were replaced by those more loyal and capable. Command structures hardened. Initiative, once a defining strength of the German army, was rebranded as disobedient. On the battlefield, the effect was immediate. Soldiers fought, knowing retreat was forbidden. Every position became a sentence. Some resisted with near-feral intensity, others accepted the inevitable in silence. Artillery became the rhythm of existence. Days lost their meaning. The ground shook constantly, the air trembled, and slowly, unmistakably, certainty settled in. Something irreparable had been lost. The decision corroded the regime from within. Distrust spread. Conversations stopped mid. The enemy was no longer only beyond the front lines, but within the system itself. A flawed assessment, a suggestion of withdrawal, could end a career or a life. Silence became survival. Still, the official narrative spoke of destiny, of history, of a future that would justify everything. But war does not obey narratives. It responds only to facts, and the facts were aligning against the Reich. Winter showed no mercy. The enemy did not pause, and the decision born of iron certainty began to reveal its true cost. Germany still had armies. It still had cities. It still had a voice that spoke of victory. But something essential had already shattered. It was not visible on maps or in communiques. It lived in the exhaustion of the soldiers, in the hollow eyes of civilians, in the rigidity of a leadership incapable of yielding. The decision that doomed the Third Reich was not a single mistake, but a path with no return or moment, where pride fused with fear, sealing the fate of millions. And as snow continued to fall silently across the east, covering bodies and weapons alike, the Reich moved forward not toward triumph, but toward an ending it no longer dared to name. The decision did not explode outward. It seeped. It traveled down chains of command, through coded messages and clipped orders, losing nothing of its weight along the way. By the time it reached the front, it had hardened into law. Hold. Stand fast. No step back. The words were short, efficient, merciless. They left no space for interpretation. Only obedience. Across the Eastern Front, the land itself seemed to recoil. Forests stood stripped and silent. Villages lay hollow, their wooden frames scorched, their wells poisoned or frozen solid. The snow fell constantly, indifferent to uniforms or flags, covering everything with the same pale mercy. Beneath it, men froze where they stood. Reflex gamed, engines failed. Fingers stiffened until they could no longer pull triggers. Still, the order remained unchanged. Field commanders began to understand the trap they were in. They could see the Soviet movements, the slow encirclements, the deliberate tightening of steel. They could calculate what headquarters refused to acknowledge. Withdrawal now would save men. Hold fast would destroy them. Some sent urgent requests up the chain. Others rewrote reports, softening reality, hoping delay might buy permission. The replies, when they came, were absolute. Positions were to be held. Sacrifice was expected. History was watching, and so the front lines became graves in waiting. Entire divisions were locked in place as enemy forces flowed around them like water around stone. Supply convoys vanished into snowstorms or enemy fire. Bread was rationed down 2 crumbs. Ammunition was counted round by round. Wounded men lay unattended, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on nothing. Medics worked until their hands shook, until bandages ran out, until there was nothing left to give. At night, the cold became personal. It crept inside boots, gloves, bones. Men pressed together in bunkers dug too shallow, sharing body heat, listening to the wind howl across the steppe like something alive. Some whispered prayers. Others recited names under their breath, afraid that silence would erase them. Above ground, flares lit the sky in brief, violent bursts, revealing shattered trees and broken silhouettes before plunging everything back into darkness. Far from the front, in rooms warmed by stoves and guarded by sentries, the war was still discussed in terms of arrows and dates. Losses were numbers. Encirclements were temporary setbacks. The maps did not show frostbite. They did not show fear. They did not show the moment when a soldier realized no relief was coming. The refusal to retreat began to reshape the character of the war. It was no longer fluid, no longer adaptable. It became rigid, brittle, like glass under pressure. Every lost position now meant annihilation instead of withdrawal. Every mistake multiplied. The enemy learned this quickly. They stopped pushing directly. They surrounded. They waited. Time became their ally. In the air, Allied bombers continued their slow, methodical work. Rail yards burned, factories shuddered and collapsed. Smoke rose in pillars that could be seen for miles. Civilians watched from cellars as their cities were dismantled, piece by piece. Mothers covered children's ears. As the sky thundered, when the all-clear finally sounded, the silence felt unnatural, like the pause after a scream. Inside Germany, the cracks widened. Trains arrived late, or not at all. Food grew scarce. The wounded returned in waves, silent, hollow-eyed, carrying the front with them into the streets and homes. People began to understand that the war they had been promised was not the war they were living. But understanding did not bring relief. It brought dread. Within the military hierarchy, fear replaced trust. Loyalty was measured not by competence, but by enthusiasm. Officers who spoke cautiously disappeared. Promotions favored obedience over insight. The system fed on itself, rewarding denial and punishing clarity. Strategy narrowed. Options vanished. The decision had created a world where there was only forward motion, even when forward meant destruction. On the Eastern Front, the consequences were undeniable. Encircled armies fought on long after logic had abandoned them. Radios crackled with desperate transmissions. Requests for airdrops, for permission to break out, for acknowledgement. Many were met with silence, others with orders to fight to the last man. The word honor was used often. It echoed strangely among the starving. Some soldiers still believed. Others fought because surrender felt worse than death. A few simply followed orders because they knew nothing else. The human mind adapts even to despair. It narrows, it focuses on the next minute, the next breath, the next sound. Survival became instinct, stripped of ideology. And then, inevitably, the lines collapsed. When they did not fall cleanly. They disintegrated. Isolated pockets of resistance flared and vanished. Roads clogged with refugees. Carts, wounded men limping westward. Horses dropped where they stood. Equipment was abandoned, buried in snow, or destroyed to keep it from enemy hands. The retreat that had been forbidden now happened anyway. But without coordination, without dignity, without hope. The decision had achieved the opposite of its intent. Instead of preserving strength, it had consumed it. Instead of inspiring resilience, it had produced exhaustion. Instead of unity, it had sown fear. The Reich was bleeding forces it could never replace. Not in men, not in time. Yet still, the language from above did not change. Speeches spoke of resolve, of destiny, of turning points just beyond reach. The words felt increasingly detached from the world they described, like echoes from another era. Those who listened no longer believed, but belief was no longer required, only compliance. The war pressed on, heavier now, slower, more suffocating. Each day carried the weight of the last. Each night brought fewer stars, more smoke. The decision continued to operate, relentless, indifferent, grinding men and nations alike into something unrecognizable, and somewhere between the frozen fields of the East and the burning cities of the West. The Third Reich crossed a threshold it could not see, a point where recovery ceased to be possible, where collapse was no longer a future event, but a process already underway. By the time anyone was willing to admit it, the cost had already been paid in blood, in silence, and in the spaces where entire armies used to exist. The moment of collapse rarely announces itself with clarity. It arrives disguised as routine, as another briefing, another order, another promise that tomorrow will be different. By now, the war had entered that phase where everyone could feel the ending approaching, but no one knew how to speak its name. The soundscape had changed, less confidence in the voices. More pauses, more glances toward doors that never opened. In the highest command rooms, the maps had begun to lie. Not intentionally at first. Small omissions. Delayed updates. A division marked as holding when it no longer existed. A front line drawn straighter than reality allowed. The truth was no longer compatible with the decisions already made, and so reality was bent until it fit the narrative. It was easier to redraw a line than to admit it should never have been defended. Those who still tried to speak honestly learned quickly how dangerous honesty had become. A general pointing to encirclement was accused of defeatism. A commander asking for withdrawal was accused of lacking faith. War, once a profession governed by calculation, had become an act of loyalty theater. Survival depended less on tactical insight and more on how convincingly one could echo the will from above. At the front, the psychological cost began to eclipse the physical one. Soldiers who had endured shelling, hunger, and cold now faced something more corrosive: abandonment. Radios crackled with static where voices should have been. Orders arrived too late to matter. Promised reinforcements never appeared. Men stopped asking when relief would come. They already knew the answer. In ruined towns along the Eastern Front, walls were blackened by fire and soot, streets littered with debris and spent casings. Civilians moved cautiously, like ghosts among ghosts. Some had survived multiple occupations, watching flags change while suffering remained constant. They listened to the distant thunder of guns and understood what it meant long before soldiers did. The war was no longer passing through. It was consuming everything it touched. Night offered no rest. Even in moments of quiet, the mind refused sleep. Every sound became a threat. The wind through broken windows sounded like footsteps. Snow sliding from roofs sounded like artillery. Men dreamed with their eyes open, reliving bombardments that had already ended. Fear became permanent, a low vibration beneath every thought. The leadership spoke of final stands, of cities that would become symbols. Stalingrad had already written the warning in blood, but the lesson was ignored. Instead of learning, the regime doubled down. What had failed once would be repeated with even greater cost. Fortresses were declared, retreats forbidden. And once again, soldiers were locked into positions that would soon be erased from the map. The enemy sensed the shift. They no longer rushed recklessly. They studied. They waited. They cut supply lines and watched time do its work. Hunger weakened resistance. Cold stiffened movement. Morale drained away silently, like heat from an uninsulated room. The war became less about battles and more about endurance. And endurance favored those who could adapt. Inside Germany, the psychological fracture spread through the population. Bombed cities produced not outrage, but numbness. People stopped counting raids, stopped cleaning rubble that would only return tomorrow. Children learned the sound of sirens before they learned to read. The idea of victory faded, replaced by a quieter question: how much longer? The wounded returning from the front carried answers no propaganda could erase. They spoke little. When they did, it was in fragments. Of orders that made no sense, of officers who vanished, of comrades left behind because stopping meant death. Their silence spoke louder than any speech. Within the inner circle, fear metastasized, loyalty tests intensified, paranoia sharpened. The decision not to retreat had created a trap not only for armies, but for leadership itself. To admit failure now would unravel everything. Authority, ideology, legitimacy, all rested on the illusion of control. And so the illusion was defended with increasing desperation. Some leaders began to believe their own fiction. Others knew the truth and chose denial. A few understood fully and did nothing, paralyzed by the weight of consequence. History would later judge them differently, but in that moment, they were bound by the same force that trapped the soldiers at the front. A system that punished reality. The front lines continued to crumble. One pocket fell, then another. The maps grew emptier. Red pins disappeared. Blue lines retreated westward no matter how firmly they were drawn. Entire armies ceased to exist, absorbed into snow, forests, and mass graves. The Reich was losing not only territory, but memory. The memory of what strength had once felt like. And still, the orders came. Fight. Hold. Die, if necessary. For many, death arrived without drama. A shell fragment, a sniper's bullet. Exposure. For others, it come a slower starvation. Infection. Exhaustion. The human body endured until it could not, then simply stopped. There were no last words. Only quiet. As the year turned and the war ground on, a realization spread that could no longer be contained, not shouted, not announced, but understood. The decision, the refusal to bend, to retreat, to adapt, had transformed a possible defeat into a guaranteed one. What could have been lost with pain was now being lost with annihilation. The Reich was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting against the acknowledgement of defeat. Every additional order, every sacrificed division, every ruined city served only one purpose: to delay the moment when the truth became undeniable. And that truth was approaching. It moved not as an army, but as certainty in the hollowed faces of soldiers, in the silence of command rooms, in the exhausted cities that no longer looked toward the future, only toward the next night. The breaking point was no longer ahead. It was already here. In the end, collapse did not arrive with a single blow. It arrived as exhaustion, as the slow extinction of choices. By the final months, the war had stripped itself of illusion. What remained was momentum without purpose, violence without strategy, sacrifice without meaning. Orders still came, but they echoed into emptiness. Units moved on paper that no longer existed in the field. Cities were declared strongholds long after they had become ruins. The decision that once promised strength now demanded only obedience, even as obedience led nowhere. At the front, resistance faded not in anger, but in quiet resignation. Weapons lay abandoned in snow-filled trenches. Soldiers surrendered not because they lacked courage, but because courage had been spent. The war had taken everything it could from them, and then asked for more. Inside the shattered cities, civilians emerged into streets that no longer resembled home. Stone and steel lay twisted together. Smoke lingered long after the fires died. There were no celebrations, no cheers of liberation, only silenci heavy and uncertain, broken by footsteps and distant voices calling out names that would never be answered. The leadership retreated into bunkers and shadows, still speaking of destiny as the world closed in. Maps were useless now. Time had overtaken every plan. The decision that forbade retreat had left nothing left to defend. When the final shots were fired, they did not sound like endings. They sounded small, almost insignificant. The war that had once roared across continents ended not with triumph, but with absence. The absence of movement, of orders, of belief. And when the silence finally settled, it revealed what the war had always been about. Not conquest, not ideology, but the fragile limits of human will, the cost of refusing to bend, the danger of mistaking pride for strength. The Third Reich did not fall because it lacked soldiers or weapons. It fell because it chose certainty over truth, obedience over reason, and sacrifice over survival. Snow covered the ruins, wind moved through empty streets. History closed the record, and what remained was not victory or defeat, but a warning, written in ash and silence, for those who would one day believe that will alone can conquer reality.